Hello, and welcome to this Ethical Dilemma in Science. I'm John Hoffman, a professor of biology at Arcadia University in Pennsylvania. These scenarios within this collection examine a potentially controversial science-related topic in order to better understand the basic science concepts involved and the associated ethical debates. The goal is not to decide upon a final, concrete, and universal decision about the use of science or technology, but to stimulate a discussion considering the different viewpoints in order to better understand the views of others. In this ethical dilemma in science, we will examine Research Ethics 101, focused on the question, is an ethical code needed for science and research? So we have to start out with a very basic question. What is ethics, and what does ethics mean? In its very simple definition, ethics is viewed as a branch of philosophy dealing with rightness or wrongness of an activity. You can think about this, depending upon the perspective. Is it right or wrong to do something? Is it a good thing to do, or is it a bad thing to do? And generally, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about theoretical guidelines for decision making. Making a decision, should I do this or should I not? And what makes these ethical decisions more difficult is the fact that they're generally going to be defined by a culture. Now, keep in mind that when I say culture, this could mean a societal group or it could be a professional field. And when we're talking about ethics, we are often addressing ethical conflicts. And these ethical conflicts arise because different cultural viewpoints are going to have different perspectives on their guidelines as to what should or should not be permitted. In essence, what is right or wrong is going to vary upon the guidelines within an individual society. So the question becomes, are ethics needed in science and research? And the question could be asked, are ethics needed, or why are ethics needed? And to try to put this into kind of a timely perspective, taking a look at where we're at sitting right now, kind of at the hopefully end of the COVID pandemic, we're looking at news accounts associated with the development of the coronavirus vaccine. Headlines in both popular press articles as well as peer-reviewed scientific articles taking a look at this vaccine miracle, the ability to provide protection against this novel disease that was unidentified and not known prior to the end of 2019. And so if we take a look at this, why are ethics needed? Are ethics needed in science and research? And so to take a look at this, again, in relationship with the COVID-19 vaccine, how did this miracle come about? And so if we take a look at a very simple timeline for the COVID-19 pandemic, an article was published January 5th, 2020, in which researchers in China put out information about this new coronavirus associated with the human respiratory disease in China. And it was thought about just initially that it was this disease that was affecting individuals in Wuhan, China. And basically, what's going on? A new disease, still, lots of controversy about, whether it emerged naturally or other things going along with it, potentially man-made. But what happened in early January 2020 was the virus had been isolated and purified, and they'd actually gone through and sequenced the genome, sequenced the genetic information within this virus, and made it available to the scientific community very early on within 2020. Within 72 days, an incredibly fast period of time, we saw the first NIH clinical trial begin with a vaccine against COVID-19. Now, normally, the development of a vaccine can take 10 to 15 years, but we're in a situation where we had an emergency. We had an outbreak of an unknown virus causing very dramatic and detrimental conditions and death of individuals. So roughly 2.5 months later, we're looking at the clinical trials beginning on a COVID-19 vaccine and extending with this kind of accelerated version of vaccine development. We saw that the US FDA, within day 341, less than a year later, December 11th, 2020, the FDA took the action to grant emergency use authorization for the first COVID-19 vaccine. Again, recognizing the importance of coming up with at least a protective mechanism against spread of the virus, as well as the ability to protect the population. 341 days, less than a year, where normal vaccine development takes 10 to 15 years. How did this come about? And so we start out looking at the history of this. And the predominant, at least the early COVID-19 vaccines, were were based on an mRNA technology. And so if we take a look at the history associated with these mRNAs and these mRNA vaccines, we see that mRNA was discovered in 1961. And so recording this in 2021, we're looking at messenger RNA and our understanding of messenger RNA being, a little more, or actually a little less, I guess, than 60 years old now at this point. Taking a look at the fact that messenger RNA was first synthesized in the lab in 1984. So roughly 20 years later, roughly 30 years ago. Roughly 40 years ago, doing math in my head here. In 1992, messenger RNA was tested as a treatment in rats for the first time. And then finally, in 2013, less than 10 years ago, there was the first clinical trial of a messenger RNA vaccine, and this would be a vaccine against the rabies virus. So what we can see is that there's been a lot of research over the last 60 years done by a wide variety of scientists to be able to characterize messenger RNA and learn about more aspects of that. In terms of the lipid-based delivery system, basically the virus the vaccine is an mRNA vaccine. So we've got information on the messenger RNA, which is going to be delivered to our cells within a lipid-based, a fat-based delivery system. Similar to what we saw with the messenger RNA, we're looking at a technology that is developed over the last 55 to 60 years. Now, in 1965, the first liposome was produced, and so this is basically a artificial structure formed by phospholipids kind of coming together and trapping material within them. Within a relatively short period of time, the liposomes were used for drug delivery in the early 1970s and were tested very quickly after that for delivery of vaccines. These liposomes, this lipid-based delivery system, was modified about 2001, roughly 20 years ago, into these lipid nanoparticles for a more consistent delivery of this. And the first drug was approved for lipid nanoparticle delivery in 2018. So as we can see, a lot was learned about messenger RNAs, a lot was learned about this lipid-based delivery system prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 in late 2019. So when we put it all together, again, this concept that we can combine messenger RNA vaccines was first tested within liposomes in mice with a vaccine against influenza in 1993. The first messenger RNA vaccine using the lipid nanoparticles was again tested in mice in 2012, leading ultimately to the first human clinical trial of a messenger RNA vaccine against influenza using these lipid nanoparticles. Now, the whole goal of these messenger RNA vaccines is to deliver the messenger RNA, which is appearing kind of in red on this image to the right-hand side here. That messenger RNA is going to be taken up by cells, and the cells are going to take that information and build proteins. They're going to build viral proteins. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that with these messenger RNA vaccines, is they're not using kind of an intact virus. They're not using killed virus. They're not even using the messenger RNA for kind of the spread of these viral particles. They're just using a messenger RNA for a surface protein, a protein specific shape that is going to be associated with infected cells, infected body cells that are expressing the messenger RNA that came from the virus. We're using kind of a small portion of that information to get cells within our body to produce those same molecules on the surface of our cells, the same shapes along the surface of our cells. And that is going to elicit an immune response. And so this is an incredibly effective and incredibly safe method of eliciting an immune response. Again, because we're not using intact or even complete viral particles. We're just using a small portion of the information within the genome of these viruses. And therefore, we can't cause the disease to be transmitted with this mRNA vaccine because not all of the information is there. The only information that is there is what's necessary for putting that specific shape along the surface. Okay, so if we take a look at it, research over the past 60 years by a number of individuals, a number of scientists kind of across the entire scientific community, both within the United States and across the globe. And so it's important to recognize the contributions of each one of these individual scientists that looked at a piece of the puzzle, that looked at developing the technology that allowed us to put all of this information together. Ultimately, it's likely that some of the people that were involved with the various aspects, the various kind of development of these technologies will be recognized at some point with a Nobel Prize. And so this is monumental work. This is kind of life-saving work, and this is probably really going to change the direction of vaccines going into the future. So we go back to our original question. Is a code of ethics required in science and research? Now, many of us have some aspect of an professional code or a societal code that we need to adhere to. As university students and members of a university community, we are committed to academic honesty, basically saying that according to our ethics within, in this case, we're looking at the Arcadia University Student Handbook and the Code for Academic Honesty. We have guidelines as to what is right and wrong. We shouldn't be cheating. We shouldn't be, taking advantage of, taking an opportunity to have an advantage over other students by using resources that are not permitted on an exam to, use cheat sheets or, notes on our palms or, whatever students are doing these days. We should not do plagiarism. That's something else we could touch on within research ethics. We should, have our work represent our own efforts in order to avoid disrupting or violating our code of academic responsibility. Taking a look at it closer to a professional code of conduct, professional code of ethics, probably the best example of this is the Hippocratic Oath, established or at least attributed to Hippocrates roughly 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. And the classic version of the Hippocratic Oath, again taken by physicians, is I swear by Apollo the physician, and Asclepius and Hygeia and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses as my witnesses, that according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this contract. And then it went through and said, what are the things that a physician should be doing? What are the things that are right and what are the things that are wrong? Now, in 1964, an academic dean at Tufts University came up with a modern one, a modern version of the Hippocratic Oath, because, probably not a whole lot of people these days, in the 20th and 21st century, are swearing to Apollo to follow the creed, follow the code of conduct that Hippocrates established. So this modern version said, I swear to fulfill to the best of my ability and judgment this covenant. And again, updated what is right and what is wrong for a physician. Now, there was an interesting slant on this Hippocratic Oath that was prepared and presented by the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine class of 2024. And again, similar to what we had with both the classic version and the modern version of Hippocratic Oath, starting with the preamble, basically saying, what is it? How is it that I'm going to kind of bind in myself into this covenant? And I want to read this because I thought it was especially telling as we look at the world and society around us in 2020, again, focusing primarily on the United States. As the entering class of 2020, we start this medical journey amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and a national civil rights movement reinvigorated by the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. We honor the 700,000 plus lives lost to COVID-19, despite the sacrifices of healthcare workers. Again, keep in mind that this is the entering class, students starting out in 2020 on their path to becoming physicians. We recognize the fundamental failings of our healthcare and political systems in serving vulnerable communities. This oath is the first step in our enduring commitment to repairing the injustices against those historically ignored and abused in medicine. Black patients, indigenous patients, patients of colors, and all marginalized populations who have received substandard care as a result of their identity and limited resources. One thing coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is a very differential kind of expectation of the risk of the disease for individuals in different populations. Very dramatic outcome differences based on the population, based on who the individuals were and their quality of care. Again, continuing on with their oath, acknowledging the privilege and the responsibility that comes with being a physician, I take this oath as a call to action to fulfill my duty to patients and to the medical profession and to society. Therefore, or thereby, I pledge as a physician and a lifelong student of medicine to, and again, it goes into what is deemed as right or wrong within the practice of medicine. So I go back to that original question. Is an ethical code needed for science and research? Is an ethical code for science and research needed? What principles should be included in an ethical code for science and research? And finally, should an oath to follow an ethical code for science and research be required for students starting out on their careers and conducting research? Should an oath be required for faculty members? Should an oath be required for professional scientists? So the goal of these ethical dilemmas in science is to kind of provide you with a little bit of a prompt, to provide you with a little bit of the background information, and then to provide you with an opportunity to discuss it amongst yourselves, and then come back to the video for a little bit additional information. So I encourage you, pause the video now, and then come back once you're done with your discussion for a little bit more information. And so coming back, this question, is a code of ethics required for science and researchers? And I want to make reference to a Nature article from 2018 in which the World Economic Forum brought together leading researchers, all under the age of 40, into a young scientist community and recognized that the World Economic Forum specifically reached out to diverse scientists from very diverse fields across the field of science, as well as different regions of the world. And they came up with these principles for researchers, a code of ethics, which is available at the link here, weforum.org. I'll put this link on Canvas and YouTube as well. And they came and said that it's necessary for our researchers to engage with the public, to pursue the truth, to minimize harm, to engage with decision makers that need to have informed information in order to be able to make their decisions, to support diversity, to be a mentor, and to be accountable. Are these principles, are these guidelines enough, or do they need? How do these principles relate to what you came up with within your discussion? So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this module. come back for any of the other modules that we're going to be posting. Thank you and have a great day.